And bring that back because the speaker, they barely see me, but it's okay. So this is the second episode of our African story. As I mentioned, and I have a few new people, so I bring back a few general principles, but forward that I want to give is the fact that once I decided to make that series of 3 talks, I didn't realize how difficult it was going to be. And one of the big difficulty is the lack of sources. There is very little written on the ancient African art for many reasons, I assume. But it made my task a little difficult, and I had to do a lot of cross-checking and so on. Bought a book thinking, okay, that's going to help me. And it barely helped. It was kind of almost confusing. So the first thing that I want to remind you of is things have changed in the different generation. Is we use now, to be more neutral, we use the term BCE for what used to be BC, just to be outside of particular religion and respect them all. So it's before Common Era is BCE. The Common Era replaces the Anno Domini. And then you will, from time to time, hear BP, which is before present. They use it for the very long periods of time. If you talk about Paleo prehistory, they use BP more than other things. Contents, I have made to make a selection. Of course, I can't show you everything. So I decided, for a very obvious reason, not to show Egypt, nor the Mediterranean littoral, because Egypt is a whole class on its own. You know, it would take me 16 lessons to give you a class on Egypt. And I'm not sure everybody would want that. And the Mediterranean littoral, or the whole part of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and so on, has been so overrun by the Carthaginian, by the Greeks, the Roman, and then by the Muslims, that we don't have any particularly typical African art, if you want. So we don't consider that almost as Africa. What we talk about is the sub-Saharan Africa. The diversity is a problem. So it is so diverse. It's, of course, it's a continent. It's a large continent. So the diversity is absolutely mind-boggling. And we saw last time what is now Sudan and Ethiopia mostly, that are already almost opposite to one another. In this case, we'll see an area that is a little more homogeneous, but not so much. And what we'll see is that the development of successive empires. So what we have is technologies that are very specific to each location. The expressions are very different. Monuments are different. They, unfortunately, not too many in the West, because mostly they were built of mud. And mud, as you know, when place where it rains and it's windy, mud has to be maintained constantly to remain. And so if you neglect a little bit, it just goes to ashes almost. Also, we have another factor that we talk about, more continuity versus distinct periods. If you look at our history in Europe, you have that has been worked on for so long that we have the Middle Age, and we have the Renaissance, and we have the Baroque period and the modern period. The historians have packed that up really nice and neatly, and so it's much easier to explain in that way. So in Africa, what we see is a much more continuous culture that really goes back to their ancestors, because they have a tremendous cult of ancestry. There are connections, and connections are mostly due to caravans. These were trading caravans, and that brought some culture from the East, for example. Let's talk about the Muslim culture has been very important in the West, coming with commercial caravans. And then we have to, unfortunately, look at foreign attitude to the past and this racial stereotyping. It is for sure, and we'll see some fabulous art that was made there. And when they were found by chance, almost every single time, the idea when it was so handsome, so beautiful, that it must have been influenced by the Greek. When actually, when they realized after a few decades that it was absolutely a local developed culture. So quite interesting. I bring you back some maps. You know how much I love maps. Well, this is the modern, the present map of Africa, and it changes almost every day because they have some wars and things. And so you have a lot of difference. We have seen, as I say, Sudan, which is at war right now, Ethiopia, that is quieted down a little bit, but is at the edge of war all the time. Conflict with Somalia and Eritrea. So what we concentrate on is going to be on the left here. It's mostly this region. So we're going to look at Nigeria, not so much Nigeria, but Mali is very important. And then you see more countries, and we'll talk about it. Benin, Togo, we don't talk about Ghana, that's the Ivory Coast, Liberia. Liberia and Ethiopia are the only two countries in North Africa that were never colonized. The only one that were not. So let's look at a map of pre-colonial Africa. That means prior to borders. And we have to realize, you know, if you think about the history of Europe, we've had borders for a long time. Africa wasn't the case. And in Europe, the borders became much more marked with the development of population. When it wasn't so populated, they didn't care so much if the border was 2 steps to the right or 2 steps to the left. Typically, most borders were made by natural accidents of nature. So you had a river, you had mountain range. These were the typical natural borders that they had. That became more specific later on. But in Africa, what we see, and it's very prominent in this map, is that you can see, for example, in green you have the Mali Empire, the Ghana Empire was the third. Then you have the Mali Empire that comes second, taken by Songhai and later on. And then you have small empires like the Yoruba and Benin and Akan. So these are every time empires that were built went to a certain point and then lost their power and were taken over by another, and then you have another empire that grows and so on. But the borders only came once the colonizers came and shared Africa between them, mostly done through the Berlin Conference in 1884-85 that regulated the European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialist period. They started by just wanting to impose trades and with their own conditions. But to effectively do that, they had to take over the country. And this is what happened. It was organized by Bismarck, who was the first chancellor of Germany, at the request of King Leopold II of Belgium, who is going to play a role in acquiring the Congo. So what we see is there were bilateral agreements prior to that one, but this is really what they call the old carved up of Africa. Of the 14 countries that were represented, 7 of them, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire, and the United States, came home without any formal position in Africa. And this is what it became after that. You now have borders, and you can see it's really very obvious with the colors here, is that borders. What you see in blue, including Madagascar, is French. All the red is British. Pink is Portuguese. blue is German. And that's only until the First World War, because then it will go east, for example, part of this is going to go to Belgium. Rwanda only will become part of the Belgian colonies as a retaliation against the war. Spanish, very little, just Spanish Sahara, which is going to be taken over later on by Italian, just Libya, they put Libya and Somalia and Eritrea. Belgium is the Congo, and then independent, what is now Nigeria and Ethiopia. So this was really the carving. That's when these borders were made. They evolved once they became independent, because it had been drawn so arbitrarily. You have to realize these were, for example, the Yoruba in that bottom part here. The Yoruba were expanding quite a bit in that area, and they were cutting pieces by the borders. And so these are the source of a lot of the conflicts that we now know. Okay, when we talk about Africa, we also have to look at very different physical geography. You can see the desert. What is searching? What's happening? Okay, it's coming back. Let me go back to that one. Yes. Okay, so you have the very dark Sahara. The Sahara was not always a desert. About 12,000 years ago, it was a savanna. And so we have the proof that there were people living there, and then they had to emigrate to more sustainable country because of the change of topography and geography. So then you have what we call the Sahel, which is that kind of dark and brown, which is a kind of low savanna, small trees and brushes and so on, but more livable than the desert, of course. Then you get the green there with all the forest and the tropical climate. Just here, seen differently, this shows you the climate classification. You have here arid desert hot. A little bit here, the arid desert cold. And then you have the arid steppe, which is really this some yellow down below here, and also arid steppe with cold and temperate climate. And then you have here in the blue tropical rainforest, monsoon, etc. So this is going to define a very different culture just because of the climate. Chronology, just to give you a little idea of how it goes. You have already some tool-using humans between 780,000 and 126,000 before present. When we say humans, we don't say that they're Homo sapiens, but they're already Homo erectus, and so already using tools. But Homo sapiens comes later. Then you have 32,000 BP. This corresponds in Europe at the moment where the Neanderthals are starting to fade away versus the Homo sapiens. We have West African hunter-gatherers occupy Western Central Africa. Then 12,000 to 8,000 BP migrated northwards as far as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, coming from the tropical area. Then different cultures will start. The teaching we have very little to show, so we will start with the Nok culture. By 1200 BCE, iron industry, which is the age of iron, corresponds to the War of Troy in Europe. The 400 BCE contact has been made with the Mediterranean civilization, and you have regular trade. And I'll show you a map with the trade. Ghana Empire starts in 300 of our era. Then we have the kingdom of Songhai that starts in 900 CE, but just a kingdom. So it's one country, you know. The Ghana Empire succeeded by the Mali Empire. We talk quite a bit about that one. And then the Songhai grow and take over the Mali Empire and become an empire itself. And then we have some other things, just as the Sokoto Caliphate. A few questions on archaeology. It is very important, of course, for any archaeologist to know where the object was found, because they need to know what is around, and often they dig around to find other objects that would be there. And this has been a huge problem, because a lot of the objects, artifacts that were found have been taken from their place of origin, taken away from their rights, so you cannot identify them with the rights, from the social, intellectual, and spiritual configuration that were the justification for their making. And that's what you say, residual fragment of an absent totality. Can the African object still nurture a fair appreciation of what it was? If it's completely taken off context, it's very difficult to know exactly what it meant. So traditional African music and dances has to be taken into account, because many of the artifacts were used within that context. So very complex rites. You have the very strong understanding of what is pure and impure. Perpetuation of the lineage. As I said, the cult of the ancestry is incredibly important. But not everybody is an ancestor. You have to live a long life to be appreciated as an ancestor. You can't have died in an impure way. Even being killed by lightning takes you away from ancestry. It's God that has killed you, so you're not an ancestor. You have to accumulate some wisdom and knowledge during your life. Then you will be appreciated as an ancestor. And they have an incredible cult of ancestry. Also, among the rituals, you have legitimization of alliances. It can be marriage, it can be just two tribes deciding to become sister tribes. And then you have, of course, a very important feeling of cohesion of the clan. A quick word on religion. They have often been just qualified of animistic beliefs, which means given a soul to any kind of object. But this is a much more complex religion than it is to be believed very often. They have different deities that have names and roles. They worship nature. They very much worship ancestors, believe in an afterlife. They also, many believe in a supreme being. And then there is a great linkage between religion and knowledge. And when an individual shows promises, they are going to raise him within the clan, within the tribe, to give him knowledge little by little, as much as he can take at the time, until he comes to maturity. So it's an interesting process. Though in the 8th century, Islam was introduced by traveling Arab trader merchant, often scholars from North Africa, and trade and goods were exchanged with gold. There is a lot of gold in that part where Ghana is. There's a lot of gold to be found. They facilitate the trade by introducing concepts such as contract law, credit arrangement, that were very dominant in the north, because you had the whole coast had these merchants coming from the Middle East and continuing to Spain at that time. So they started coming down just because they knew they were gold and other precious metals. And so they would exchange their stuff for the gold. In the late 15th century, Portuguese traders and missionaries began arriving in West Africa. They are right now more dominant in the south. So Christianity is more present in the south. Islam is more present in the north. The materials of what we will find in sculpture, the early sculptures that are found are made of terracotta and bronze, because once the terracotta is baked, if you want, it's passed through the kiln, it's hard and it's going to be more resistant. The problem with wood that they were using is it's demolished by the termites. There's enormous termites there, and they eat anything made of wood. So that's a problem. Later on, you find mostly wooden, and then you have ceramic decorated or sculpted pottery, and then stone, but far less than what you find in the other, in the East. Jewelry is a popular art form. It used to indicate rank, also affiliation with a group, made of tiger's eye stone, hematite, sisal, coconut shell beads, and ebony wood. Colorful textile, mud cloths, and the Celtic cloths that you have as an example there on the table. Mosaics made of butterfly wings or colored sand. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any example for that. So this shows you the role of the Portuguese, because they're going to play quite a role there, especially in the slavery, in the trade of slaves. In 1494, we had a very important treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, that is written by the Pope, and is going to split the earth in two regions, the one that can be colonized by the Spaniards, the other one by the Portuguese. And so what you see in red here is what belongs to Spain. And then these are colonies of the Portuguese. They will push, though, and having carving the certain here later on. But as you can see, the whole coast of Africa and India, of course, and so on, was totally had all kind of trading posts by the Portuguese, and they're going to play quite a big role in exchanging goods, but also in the beginning of slave trading. They are going to be replaced by the Dutch. The Dutch, once they, in the 17th century, become a powerful empire, decide to go and they literally kick out the Portuguese from where they are and replace them. So let's focus on West Africa, and again, I'll show you the same map, but larger. We're going to mostly and these different empires and cultures. To go back into the prehistory, we have to go north and a little bit more to the east than the, let me see, I probably show you the map. We're going to go actually about here to see these rock paintings in what is now Algeria. There are amazing rock paintings there and petroglyphs. So it's very known, it's the edge of the desert. And we know at that time the desert was livable. So there were a lot of people with animals that they were raising and so on. And so here is some examples of the magnificent, I mean, there are walls of paintings in Tassili and Alger. So you see two examples there showing people with the cattle, they have bows and arrows, people dancing, and then these superb petroglyphs down below also from that region. Pardon?
Those are carvings on the bottom?
These are animals. So
I know, but are they carvings?
yeah,
Carvings.
they're carving in the rock. And you can really see them. And they're so beautiful. And you almost have a feeling they have this carving. You can imagine that they were almost painted. It was quite interesting. So these go back to 8,000 BCE in the top and about 7,000 BCE in the bottom. And this is a reproduction of an actual rock painting. This is the copy that is in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, but of a shaman dancing, and you have people around him, a white woman actually. And just a breathtaking picture of that part of the desert there. It is really red. They call the Tabha Rouge at Janet in south of Algeria. That's their Sedona, without the houses. Picture box. Wow.
Anne,
Yes.
can you walk away from your camera? We can't understand you very well.
Yes, I was sorry. I was showing something on the screen. So I'm just showing that this is our Sedona. It's their Sedona, I should say. So in Senegal, we're going back to the coast, to the west coast. There are a lot of stone circles. And that's really interesting, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds of stone circles. And the other day I saw on PBS, they had a whole program by a Senegalese historian that was trying to save them because the Muslims look at it as being kind of a wrong belief, if you want. So he is trying to make them understand that they can compute on these stone circle the moment where the Ramadan starts and stops. And that has saved the stone circles because otherwise they thought it was just the wrong belief. So these type of circles that go back to about the same time, by the way, as Stonehenge. They spread across a region of about 12,000 square miles. There are also tumuli, so tombs that are among these. There are 4 large sites in Gambia and Senegal. And they say they compute about 29,000 stones and 70,000 monuments. Here is a map showing you the trade routes. And so you can see that a lot of it goes from the north to the south, but then you have many that come from the east and literally come from the Middle East and then through Egypt and end up there. And the big centers, we will see Timbuktu, talk about this has. So you can appreciate this will become a big university. So let's look at the first culture. Yes, and the gold fields in that kind of ochre color. On the map, you can see the places where they have a lot of gold. And that's what the Portuguese were after, and later on the British. So let's look at the Nog culture that dates from 1500 BCE to 500 CE. They, again, very little was found, and it's almost chance finds. We cannot say that there is a systematic exploration of the underground or whatever, but typically it's a peasant who is going to dig something and suddenly, wow, he finds a cache of objects. And these are these wonderful terracotta dating back from between 500 BCE and 500 CE. It is now in the Louvre. It had a large-scale economic production, mostly part of the funerary culture. The earliest sculpture probably were developed in 900 BCE. And you have all kind of figures. We'll see a few, some wielding slingshots, bows and arrows, hunting, trapping, and so on. But they very interesting in their positions. That's a male figure. And here, a series of faces grouped together. And unfortunately, again, we have very little background on how these were built, but I think they're very interesting. Now, the next period that is really interesting is the Ghana Empire. It was a more complex methods of producing art that were developed at that time, and we'll see some bronze work and bronze and so on. Very interesting early culture, and this is to give you an idea of the landscape. So you see the river that is completely, you know, it's incredibly large on the left part of the stream. Of course, this is present now. But again, by chance find in Gene, which was an earlier important town, they found some extraordinary terracotta. It's so expressive. It's just the plasticity of the terracotta is beautiful. So Gene is located on the Niger River. It is in the country of Mali nowadays. And these were among the oldest urbanized centers. This archaeological site is located about 3 kilometers from the modern town of Gene. Trade was mostly domestication of the African rice. And we'll see that this remained occupied and became quite a center later on. This, to me, looks very Mesoamerican. Isn't that? You look at some Maya sculptures are very similar. Dating back the 13th to 15th century of our era. And here, equestrian figure. He looks like a llama. But he was a warrior. He had the helmets and the quiver at the back. So the first real big empire is the Mali Empire. Ghana Empire was big, but wasn't as sophisticated. But the Mali Empire is quite interesting. It evolved, but ended up taking that whole region circled in red. Yeah, sorry, then people calling me for my birthday. Anyway. So
Alexander? Oh, okay. I'm in the back, okay.
sorry, but I have forgot to mute them. Let me mute them because otherwise we don't. Okay. Magda, I'm in class right now. Can you call me later? Okay. So as you can see, quite a large region. And this was progressively, the name of the rulers at the time were Mansa. As you can see, Mansa Musa being the most known. And recently there was a whole series of articles about him at the BBC and in France. He's considered as the richest man that ever lived, was Mansa Musa in the early 14th century. So we're going to look at it. So this was during his period. It was Mali's golden age. We had big contacts with the Muslim culture through the trades. And what they found is that they were so well organized. They had such good ideas that what happened is that very often the ruler converted to Islam, but the rest of the population remained in the indigenous beliefs. But little by little, with Mansa Musa, for example, he's going to build some huge mosques, and then some university. He's going to call on scholars from Spain and from North Africa to come and teach. And Tombouctou, his main city, is going to become a university town. So here you have a trans-Saharan caravan routes. So you can see some come from Ethiopia, some from Egypt, and then you have the rest going to the north and to your main place, Tombouctou, Gao, and you see Djenné south of Tombouctou. It was so known, the importance of the Empire of Mali, that it appears on the map. Oh, sorry. No, there. Yes. On the map, I have to go further. Yeah, by Abraham Kresk, that shows on these 8 pages the trading routes that were happening in the world at the time. And the important part that we want is this, that represents Mansa Musa. So he was this black lord, and this was written on the map. This black lord is called Muse Meli, that's another name for him, and is the sovereign of the land of the black people of Geneva, which is Ghana. This king, the richest and noblest of all these lands, due to the abundance of gold that is extracted from his land. He lived between 1280 and 1337. He was the ninth Mansa of the Mali Empire, claimed, as I mentioned, to be the wealthiest person in history: gold mining, silver sold, ivory trade, and slave trade. We have to realize slave trade happened from ever you can remember. Whenever you had fight between some tribes, the losers very often became slaves and were used that way, but in a very different way, let's see. He achieved close ties with the rest of the Muslim world, particularly the Mamluk and the Marinid sultanates. He recruited scholars from the wider Muslim world and established Timbuktu at the center of Islamic learning. What is really interesting, and we have the story about it, is that he went on the Hajj to Mecca, as he was supposed to do as a good Muslim once in his lifetime. And we have an idea of what he did. On his way, he was accompanied by about 12,000 troops and about 20,000 slaves, all dressed in gold. And they were distributing gold on their way through Egypt to the Hajj, to Jeddah, to the Mecca. So he stayed for 2 months in Egypt to be in contact with the people there, and then came back, and he died shortly after that. So extremely important person, and he built what was the Tombouctou Mosque that unfortunately has been damaged by some battles that happened a few decades ago. These countries are in constant war with rebel troops and so on. But this is a mud mosque. This is photographed in 1905. But as you can see, that mosque has to be maintained constantly. All the time you have people adding mud and stabilizing. If you don't, it's going to go to nothing. But huge mosque with a madras next to it, so for studying, and then a university. And we will see some of the incredible manuscripts that exist in that part of the place. And this is another view of the mosque, but nowadays, as you can see, quite interesting architecture. Djenné, that is in the south, also had a very large mosque, but unfortunately, because of constant battle, you can see down on the left, this is what was left because it was not maintained. And so in the mid 19th century, they rebuilt the mosque, but in a very European, European flavor that looks more like a semi-church than the mosque that it was originally. And this is an idea of the architecture in the streets of Djenné. So very similar, as you can see, the principles are the same as for the building of the mosque. What is interesting, as I mentioned, this was such a center of learning in Timbuktu that they have nowadays more than 10,000 manuscripts. And here are some of them, manuscripts for mathematics, astronomy, all kinds of topics. And the problem is they don't have much budget. And so there is a huge, huge danger that these manuscripts are going to become endangered because of climate and so on. But here you can see an absolutely magnificent pieces. About 100,000 manuscripts. I was below the number. So here is an example of the type of manuscript they had. And so there is actually some organization that are trying to work in protecting this. As when you see in Europe, you know, or in the States, it's under a certain humidity and temperature, constant temperature and so on. And over there, all you see, it's on shelves.
Are they mostly Arabic?
Yes, yeah, because it's Mansa Musa, who at that time had become Muslim, and so he called on Arabic scholars to come in and to. But you can see the quantity of them, and unfortunately, the condition they are in. So the Mali Empire was taken over by the Sangha Empire, and life went on. They kept these cities, and by that time, the rulers were converted to Islam. So we're now going to look at the southern part of that Western Africa and what we call the forest empires that are more the places like the Akan, Yoruba, and so on. These are people from the forest. They're very dense forests there, and so it calls for a different culture too. So you see, is the distribution nowadays, so that you can find. But the interesting thing that I want to point out is that, for example, the country of Benin had a beautiful capital, that's Benin City, and is in the middle of Nigeria. So it can be a big problem if they have to repatriate some works. It's going to go to Nigeria when the culture of Benin is in Benin country. And this is all that carving out. The Gold Coast, so you have that whole part where you had a lot of gold and a lot of underground resources. The Ashanti Empire is a very interesting period between 1701 and 1901. They were, as I mentioned, connected quite well with Egypt, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Europe. It is mostly the modern Ghana. And then you have the Akan-speaking people. Akan-speaking are distributed in that whole region. So again, it's split by borders. And here you can see, for example, part of the Ashanti culture is a very important object, which is the golden stool. And it is interesting, it goes back most probably, they believe, to the 13th century. It's made of solid gold that nobody can touch. The only one that can touch is the ruler. He can't sit on it. It's a stool, but it's just always carried with clothes and so on to protect it. And when a new ruler is installed, this golden stool is put on a seat next to him. He can't sit on it, he's standing next to it, but it's the symbol of his power. The Ashanti worked a lot with gold and were trading gold, and there's a whole culture around that trade, that gold trade. And so, for example, here are some tools to store and to weigh the gold, to make sure, as you can know, it's so precious that it was gold powder. They had to have exact weight to know what they were selling. So what you have on the top left is a spoon that was to transfer the gold dust. The little adorable box that you see there was made to hold some gold into it. But the two pieces that you see at the bottom are gold weight that are made of brass and made to weigh exactly what they wanted. And then they had a scale, and you would have the powder, the gold powder on one side, and you have the weight, and that they knew once you were at a good equilibrium between the two, that was the proper weight for the gold. And these gold weights are absolutely wonderful. There are periods of it. The first were geometric, then you have animals, and then you end up with human beings. What is quite interesting, you see the two lizards gold weight there, that are, the Penn Museum has a whole collection of them, by the way. As you can see, I'm missing two legs. And these were probably cut down because it wasn't making the proper weight. And so they just cut the legs to make sure that the weight was correct. The other one, same thing, you have these birds, 3 birds on the pyramid, and one bird has a ring around the foot. That was to add some weight to the weight, so it was the correct number. But these are some of the objects that were made. And again, very little is to be found. A lot has been looted because it was gold and probably just melted or taken in, and is in private collection that we don't even know of. So this one represents an enemy chief killed in battle, and it would be attached to the Asante king's state sword. This weighs 3.3 pounds in solid gold. And this is an extraordinary object. This is a soul washer badge, aqua foconmu, from the 18th, 19th century. And this, for the, in Akan thought, gold is considered an earthly counterpart to the sun and the physical manifestation of life's vital force called Ka. And these gold discs are worn as a protective emblem by important members of the court, including royal attendants, as soul washers. And it's an incredibly beautiful design. As you see there on the table, we talk about textiles. They go back a long time. These are normally all natural dyes. Nowadays, I would assume they also have some chemical dyes. But as you can see, these kente cloths made mostly in Ghana, and you have 2 examples there on the table. The colors mean things, and the design means things, and also the way you wear it. You can see the gentleman there on the right wearing it is also a mark of your rank. So the colors, black is maturation, white purification, yellow preciousness, blue peacefulness, and red bloodshed. And incredibly, for those of you that have been to Africa, when you see people in the street that have these very colorful, in Congo, we call them boo-boo. It's just a pleasure to look at, and they have these big turban around the head. It's magical. So the next empire is the Yoruba. And the Yoruba, again, it's not restricted to one country. Again, at that time, it's an area, and it's where the population goes. So you can see it's taking here in the Middle East, it's taking many different things. And the main place we're going to talk about is Ife, because again, chance find. You can imagine what is still underground or what has been looted since. And you can see with where you have the mask, Ife, this is where what used to be the Yoruba Empire. This is an old picture showing the palace of the king of Oyo around 1900. It's been colorized, and it shows the king in all his regalia with his attendants and slaves on both sides. So a lot of formal attires and decoration. And what is interesting, again, as I mentioned, the wood, we cannot have very old wood because it's been eaten up. But this gives you an idea. This dates back to the early 20th century, but it's just a continuation of a tradition. This is a veranda post. So you had the verandas, and you had these very sophisticated sculpture that were holding the roof of the veranda. Where with animals and different figures. If they did an incredible truth. And it's apparently a peasant that, so it was about 3 feet below the earth. And they found that series of bronze heads. Actually, they're not bronze, they're brass, but they always talk about bronze. That whole series of heads. Unfortunately, they ended up very quickly in the British Museum, as you can see on the right. This is the display in 1948, not very fancy, because they couldn't believe when they found it and when they were shown to the archaeologists, they could not believe that that was made by Black people. They were too beautiful. And so this immediately mentioned the fact that this must have been done under the influence of the Greeks. And it took decades to finally realize that that was absolutely the Yoruba culture, and that they were extremely talented and beautiful. So unfortunately, again, these heads were sold very quickly and around the world to collectors and different museums. Nothing, of course, was left in Ife or in the Yoruba Empire. But I'm going to show you a few examples for you to appreciate how incredibly beautiful they are. So this is a portrait. We believe these were all royalties or part of the family of the royals. They became the ancestors. And so these are these extraordinary faces. Also, we have to appreciate that bronze was part of their culture for a long time. Bronze is not an easy technology. And so they were extremely advanced in the making of these beautiful heads. He was one of the rulers. Often these bronze were made from terracotta molds, and then they would go through the whole typical process of lost wax and so on. But I think they're absolutely magnificent. Beautiful features. And the problem again is this is a chance find. Imagine what else is to be still found or. And just to show you also the sophistication of the costume, they're superb. These are Gelede costume for the Yoruba community in Benin, where they had special rites, rituals, where they would dress up for the coming of age of a young girl or a young boy. Actually, the coming of age of girls is more typically celebrated all together, the whole tribe, whereas the boy is by just a few. So quite interesting that they segregate between the two, but superb costume there that are used by these tribes. Now, part of that region where the Yorubas was Benin, which is formerly Dahomey, and has taken the name of Benin not too long ago. Prior to 1600, Benin comprised a variety of areas with different political systems and ethnicities. They had city-states along the coast, and that had Yoruba and other population. You want to take a break or do you want to go on? We have about 20 minutes. Go on. Okay, so Benin, as you can see, is just a little sliver of the country. The Benin city is there. So this used to be Benin, was a much larger place. Benin city had a beautiful royal palace, but unfortunately, that was the time where Britain had its eyes on the trades there. And they came one day to try to see the ruler of Benin, to try to establish some trades. But the ruler knew that most of the time when they were coming with a delegation, they ended up taking over the country. And so they were very dubitative in their ideas, if you want. And so they decided, they literally slaughtered that delegation that came, and the Brits came back with a whole army and demolished Benin city. The palace, and you can see just one wall that was a big place with lots of treasures, was burned down accidentally, and the whole city was demolished. Finally, the ruler was actually exiled, but they took everything that existed in that palace, and they were treasures. This gives you one idea of one wall. They were all textured and had niches. For each of the previous rulers, they had niches with a bust of the ruler and different objects, important objects for them. Just to give you an idea, these are two of the doors of the palace that still exist. As you can see, beautifully sculpted, showing the ruler on the left, and on the right, some musicians playing for him. And this would have been an example of an altar for one of the previous rulers. So the palace was very large and had this station all around with that, plus the famous plaques that you saw on the front, the first slide, that I showed these bronze or brass plaques that completely decorated the palaces in a certain sequence, because that meant something. It talked about each ruler and the story of the kingdom. And here are pictures of the Brits after the destruction of the palace, with all these plaques on the ground, as you can see, and elephant tusks and other sculpture and bust and so on that they found. And of course, everything, or almost everything, ended up in the British Museum. And not in the proper order, because nobody kept the proper order. But this is mostly, the biggest collection is in the British Museum, but there are some in many other museums. including the Met, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These plaques were talking about the story of these rulers of Benin, and here's one of them, as you can see, absolutely amazing thing. They have that very special kind of collar that hides their neck and protects their neck. As you can see, he's on a horse. So that helps us dating it. That we know that must be between 1550 and 1680. It is not made of bronze, though they always call the bronze plaques, but they are made of brass. Were made actually from bracelets worn by the, I'm going to skip quickly and then come back, bracelets worn by the Portuguese. They had these big bracelets and they would exchange these bracelets against gold or whatever. And they would melt these, and these were the basis for their plaques. You can see this is representing a Portuguese actually with the bracelet on the arm. But just an amazingly complex composition. If you look at this, they depict an oba. The oba was the generic term for king, and his attendants. The oba wears his coral beaded regalia, and then you have the attendants hold shields above his head to protect him from attacks or the hot tropical sun. We need some now. As you can see, we have a big difference in size, which is comparable to what the Europeans were doing with the early Byzantine frescoes or icons. It's hierarchical scale. So the most important person is much bigger and the others have a very small size. And as you can see, he rides side saddle on the horseback. This is another one that is at the Metropolitan Museum. It's beautiful again. You see the king with his attendants, and then the very typical coif that you can see again in the mask that I brought there. It's derived from the same culture, as you can see. And here you have some warriors too. These are just a few examples that I'm picking up. This is in Berlin. And here in LACMA, in Los Angeles County Museum. Now, the Met wants to look really good. And lately, very lately, they decided to send back these two plaques to Benin because I think it belongs there, though they don't talk about the other beautiful ones there, which are much more beautiful than these two. But these were offered by a collector and they decided it wasn't proper, so they should send it back to Benin. And as well as one of the heads, these bronze heads, that they were offered by a dealer and that they found didn't have proper origin. And so they very generously have sent that back to Benin. Take it the way you want. Other pieces that were at the palace, this is the brass snake's head. That's 18 pounds. So these were double heads actually that were over the lower part of the palace turret. They would come in pair, two to a tower. Smaller objects were also beautiful, and these are pendants of typically queen mothers made of ivory, but also with details of iron and copper. That's from the Edo people in Benin. As you can see, the features are different between the two, but they would come typically by two and be hanging at the belt of one of the descendants. and was, of course, taken to the British Museum by the same invaders. And here the head of an oba, as you can see, with this big collar that protects the face. As you can see, they all have a distinct physiognomy. And this other very beautiful head of a queen mother. They also did animals. This is a rooster figure that's decoration for the palace. Or these leopards, aquamanil. So these were holding water and would be used to pour water in special ceremonies. They're not very large. It's about 15-inch long. And then they were also making things, Portuguese asked them to make things for European use. And this is an example of an ivory spoon that was made in Benin for the Portuguese market. Now, the British Museum, which is not ready to send back the plaques, is feeling very sorry for what they did, apparently, and have decided to build a new museum of West African art that they will incorporate in the Benin city ruins, which are in Nigeria. And so that big museum that is supposed to represent pretty much what the former palace looked like is going to be built at the expense of the British Museum in Benin City. And everybody hopes that they will be placed for the plaques. But there's again that big problem is that this is Nigeria now and Benin is on the other side. Other cultures, Igbo, bronze ceremonial pot. These are this is 9th century bronze. So look at the work of these bronzes and imagine how they were made. I mean, this is a very sophisticated culture that would be able to make these type of textures. They were found while digging in a compound in 1939. And finally, that was entirely open between 59 and 64 by a British man. That excavation revealed also about 700 high quality artifacts of copper, bronze, and iron, as well as 165,000 glass, carnelian, and stone beads. These are the oldest bronzes that were found in West Africa. This is a staff head. And this one, a bronze ceremonial vessel in form of a shell. Isn't that beautiful? And then some bronze pots. And now hold your breath. Are you sure we are in Africa? And this is part of the Dogon culture in Mali. For almost 1,000 years, the Dogon people that were an ancient ethnic group had faced religious and ethnic persecution, mostly through jihads by dominant Muslim communities that were trying to convert them. And they finally decide to retreat and reuse that cliff that is so similar to what we have here in Arizona. I had to really look at it twice before I believed that this was not in the four corners or whatever, but very similar idea and very similar coloring. I mean, it's also iron oxide, quite interesting. And they found also the Dogon has a very particular style in their works, very rectilinear. So here are two objects that you can find, an equestrian figure here. This is made of wood, and so has survived. And the master, they know because he made many sculptures there. As you can see, the eyes are very slanted. And so they call him the master of the oblique eyes. And then what you could compare to Kachinas almost are some of these people with the Satimbe mask and the incredible series of masks that are part of their ritual that they still do regularly. All these coming of age, and so as you find with the Apaches here, are still quite alive. So I hope you have, as I have, when I prepared this, enjoyed the incredible artistic skills of this population. And I just want to leave you with questions, because obviously, and particularly here, but it's similar to many other cultures, there were various efforts to pressure museums to repatriate these objects. It's gaining momentum. And although it's not clear whether they would be returned, in this case, to the Oba or be considered national patrimony, becoming the property of Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments. The ongoing dialogue between museum and nations from which important objects like those from Benin were forcibly removed highlights the complexity of the current post-colonial world. Should formerly colonized areas be repaid for the damage inflicted on them by colonial powers? Who is responsible for doing so, and how? Who has the ethical right to the ownership, display, and preservation of these important pieces of cultural heritage? So think about it. And then next time we have something, again, very different. And we will look at Asian art from Center to South Africa. Extremely different. I mean, it's a completely different climate and another culture too. So thank you for being there. I hope you've enjoyed these things, that they were a surprise for you, hopefully, or confirmation. Stop the recording.